Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
If you're a fan of MMA, then chances are you are no stranger to the name Dana White. He's the man, the myth, the legend who lifted the UFC from the depths of hell and up into mainstream relevancy. Chances are that this man is responsible for why you're interested in the sport today. Think about your favorite fight, whether it was Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafssonn, or whether it was something more recent like Nate Diaz versus Connor McGregor. These fights likely don't exist if Dana White didn't take over as president of the UFC in 2001. So, if you knew nothing about the UFC, you'd likely assume that Dana White was the people's champ. You'd likely assume that he was beloved by fans and fighters alike. After all, he was the godfather of the organization, the man who guided the league to its insane levels of success. However, you'd be wrong. Well, you'd be half wrong at least, because the fact of the matter is, Dana White is one of the most polarizing figureheads in the entire realm of sports. It seems like the consensus opinion of him is twofold. Some view him as a legend, a leader, a visionary, and a fair man, but others view him as a shark, a greedy and self-serving person who exploits his fighters by underpaying them for his own personal gain. Well, what if I were to tell you that both opinions are probably true? What if I were to tell you that he is both a fair and self-serving man? You're probably saying, but Dennis, how can that be? Nobody can be fair while also being exploitative. Well, my friend, perhaps you are correct. However, I'm going to attempt to validate that seemingly contradictory statement. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why Dana White's story is a classic case of you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. In this video, I will explore the three main principles on which Dana White built the UFC, and they are stubbornness, resilience, and self-sufficiency. Hopefully, you can come away from this video with a better understanding of why the same principles that led to the UFC's success are the same principles which are ultimately responsible for the way Dana White treats his fighters today. I also hope that you will come away from this video understanding why there might be some value in constantly evaluating the principles which guide your life as you progress through it. Before we can dive into the principles which Dana White built the UFC on, we must first establish some context. Who exactly is Dana White? So, let's imagine that your name is Dana. You were born in Manchester, Connecticut. Your family life was turbulent since you guys moved a lot, going from the East Coast to the West Coast and then back to the East Coast again before you guys finally settled down in Boston. Life went on as usual for you. For the most part, you felt like you were a typical teenage boy, engaging in random activities, simply seeking excitement and things to do in order to take up your time. However, you always had an innate drive to succeed, but it wasn't something that you fully understood about yourself yet. It was something subconscious, an uncontrollable urge to be great. Eventually, you found boxing, and it was perfect. The competitive spirit that fighting brought out of you made you feel alive. You were at home in the gym. You felt at ease practicing your jab cross combos and sparring with other boxers. However, even though you had dreams of professional boxing, you were a practical person and understood that life went on regardless, so you never got too hung up on it. Hey guys, my name is Dennis and I make videos about sports, business and psychology. I plan on dropping 1 to 2 videos per week for the foreseeable future, so if you're enjoying this so far, I'm asking if you could please subscribe. Also, just drop a random comment below just to help the algorithm. That's it, thanks. Eventually, you tried your hand at college, but it appeared as if the universe had different plans, since on 2 separate occasions, you dropped out. It was clear that college just wasn't in the cards for you. Regardless, you would use that as no excuse. You started doing odd jobs, whether it was working road construction or being the valet at a fancy hotel. Turns out that the hotel job stuck, and you stayed there and soon started making some decent money. And since you weren't rich, you valued every last cent. As a matter of fact, you maybe valued it too much. Because when you had disputes with the other staff about the way the tip should be split, you would go into the hotel's basement and fight it out. To them, it was just two people fighting over money. But to you, it was more than that. It was two people competing, trying to prove why they deserved the money more. Some time went by, and even though the hotel job was cozy, you realized that you had to do something in the fight business. It was like a virus. The urge to work in the fighting business was following you everywhere you went. You eventually gave in and decided that you would quit your hotel job to pursue something in the fighting business. So, you started out hosting boxing classes. At first, it was just teaching kids for free, but you networked and you made connections, so you managed to extend your client base to adults who wanted to keep in shape. Then, after some time, your class sizes got bigger, and you were beginning to create some momentum for yourself. However, something unfortunate happened which derailed your whole career trajectory. You were ambushed by 3 gangsters, and although you held your own, the damage they inflicted upon you was severe. You suffered from partial deafness, vertigo, and dizziness. Thus, any chance of you becoming a professional fighter went away that day. In any case, you had bigger issues. Some mobsters tried to extort you, and since you weren't done with life, you packed your things and moved across the country to Las Vegas. After moving, you reconnected with old childhood friends, the Fertitta brothers, and soon you rekindled your close relationship with them. While in Vegas, you realized that there were a ton of potential opportunities for you to capitalize on. You still had the drive to work within the world of fighting, so you started off by managing some fighters. Your next venture was an apparel brand, which turned out relatively successful. You now had the experience and confidence to begin to venture into more complex business territory. Eventually, you attended your first UFC event. You fell in love with MMA but realized that the current controlling organization wasn't doing it justice. You had the belief that the UFC could be something more. Soon, you got yourself into the MMA business by serving as a manager to a few UFC fighters. However, your real moment of revelation came when you got access to the UFC's financial statements because of one of your client's contract disputes. You realized that this was your opportunity. You had a vision of what you could do to take both the sport and the league to the next level. So, you pitched your idea to the Fertitta brothers and asked them to buy the business. It wasn't easy because of the UFC's negative reputation, and many persons close to the brothers advised them against the purchase. In spite of that, against all odds, the brothers purchased the UFC for what was initially supposed to be $1 million. However, the brothers would only get a 50% ownership. That simply wasn't enough. You knew that to realize the UFC's full potential, you needed people who were 100% committed. So, you and the Fertitta brothers came back with another offer, $2 million for 100% of the company. And before long, the deal was done. The Fertitta brothers got 90% while you got 10%. Now, even though you managed to get the UFC, the real battle was just beginning. You realized that since the owner sold almost all of the company's assets, you were essentially at square one. All you had was a single octagon and the company's brand name. So, the first thing you did was buy back all the merchandising rights and all the licensing rights. The next step was to host a successful pay-per-view. However, this was far easier said than done. Due to the UFC's reputation, the sport was flat out banned in many states. So, you spent the next months tirelessly working, tweaking the rules and lobbying until finally the ban on the sport was lifted in a majority of those states. In spite of this, the money still didn't come in. The sport was still underground and far away from the mainstream's grasp. Since there was no profits, the debt started to pile up and the future of the UFC began to look bleak. You realized that there was a chance you were wrong. Perhaps you should have never got caught up in this. Perhaps you devoted the last couple years of your life to a lost cause. Soon, you and the Fertitta brothers decide it's time to sell. You decide that you've had enough. And eventually you find a buyer that's willing to take it off your hands for $7 million. That's 3 times more than what you bought it for. But you realize that it wasn't enough. You realized that you were settling. You realized that you were selling both yourself and the vision short. So, you and the Fertitta brothers decide that you try once again. Over the past couple years, you tried countless marketing techniques, but none of them worked. However, you think you may have found the right one. It was a Hail Mary, but you were confident that it could work. The idea was The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show. It was a competition where you would take potential fighters and watch them compete for a chance to earn a UFC contract. The idea was good, but now you needed the execution. But as expected, it was not easy. In spite of pitching it to a lot of cable companies, most of them weren't willing to take the risk involved with making a show. So, with the fate of the UFC on the line, you decided that you'd simply make it yourself. All you would need to do was then ask the cable channel to air it. Now, even though you were making progress, the roadblocks were unavoidable. The next one came in the form of needing to find advertisers who would be willing to buy slots during your show. This was much easier said than done. You tried ad executive after ad executive to no avail. It reached a point where you researched a particular executive's schedule and constantly tried to lay weight him in order to pitch your brand. And after months of terrorizing this executive, he finally caved and handed you your first ad deal. So after all the work, after all the labor, you finally had your reality show, and it went on to air on Spike TV, where it was a massive hit. And then the second season was even bigger. This success brought droves of attention and eventually fans to the sport, and thus it wasn't long before the UFC was viewed as a legitimate brand, and soon it was solidified as a premier sporting league, even managing to get contracts with both Fox and ESPN in the following years. Now everyone knows what the UFC is. Earlier I stated the principles I would cover in this video. I hope hearing his life story will give you context in order for you to better understand these principles. The first major principle is stubbornness. Have you ever tried working with someone who is stubborn? Think back to that one coworker or that one student in your university group. I'm sure working with them was absolute hell. However, the reality was that even though nobody likes a person who is stubborn, Dana White's stubbornness is what allowed the UFC to survive. When they were advised to not buy the league, he stubbornly refused. His stubbornness was what put him in a position to become the president of the UFC. When things were going well at the hotel job, he stubbornly refused to settle. He wanted more. His stubbornness was what made him pursue a career in fighting in the first place. Dana spent decades building something which most people thought was going to be a waste of time, but his stubbornness served as an asset. It was a force which helped keep his dreams alive. So let's put yourself in his shoes. Why would he change now? Why would he listen to the same people who would have probably advised him to quit before he even started? Ultimately, there's a fine line between stubborn and stupid. But if you have a vision, then it seems like the best thing you can do is to identify that line and walk its entire distance. The second major principle is resilience. Here's something you've probably heard before.
The night is darkest just before the dawn.
Now, for many people, this is no comfort. For many, this does not ease the anxiety caused by the uncertainty of their future. Many end the journey at this point. Oftentimes, they would be making the right decision. However, if you put in the work and you manage to be lucky, then being resilient can be one of the greatest choices that a person makes. The UFC came to the brink of destruction many times, and every time Dana managed to stave off death, he managed to bring the company back from the brink every single time. He got rejected by an executive multiple times, but still pursued the lead until he finally got the advertisement deal. He tirelessly lobbied so that the MMA would be sanctioned in every state. The fact of the matter is, having to constantly be resilient over such a long period of time hardens a man. Every day he wakes up and probably reads a new headline about how he exploits or underpays his fighters. Whether or not those headlines are true isn't relevant right now. What I'm trying to say is that due to the resiliency and thick skin that he had to develop over the years, when you combine that with his stubbornness, there's absolutely no way that these headlines or constant attacks in the media will ever get him to cave. And if you're a person who's desperately lobbying for change within the UFC, then it would be pretty hard not to hate him. After all, This man, in spite of the constant pressure and pleas from the general public, appears to care so little for his fighters that he refuses to make any changes to how he pays them. So, even though his resilience is a big reason why the UFC even exists today, it is also the reason why he will probably never change the UFC's pay model and thus continue to be reviled by many players and fans for the foreseeable future. Self-sufficient. The third principle is being self-sufficient, and while I don't believe this principle has directly led to him becoming hated, the role it played in helping to take the UFC to the next level is so great that I had to include it on this list. When Dana White was threatened by mobsters and forced to leave his city, he landed in Vegas without much to his name. In spite of the strenuous circumstances, he didn't let that stop him. He hustled and started his own boxing class in order to get by. He then followed that up by starting his own merchandising brand. Then he started to manage players. I'm sure you're starting to catch my drift. In spite of the cards he got played, Dana always found a way to create value for himself. When the UFC was on the brink and decided that they needed a Hail Mary hit with the reality TV show that no network wanted to produce, Dana, like many times before, applied the principle of self-sufficiency. He just decided that the UFC would produce the show themselves. This show is the reason why the league exists as we know it today. Now, Dana White did not build the UFC by himself. As a matter of fact, nothing worthwhile was created through the efforts of one single person. Nevertheless, the principle stands. Whether it's a group of persons or an individual, if you can find a way to rely on yourselves, then that will always increase your chance of achieving success. So even though nobody hates Dana for being self-sufficient, his ability to be self-sufficient allowed him to be both stubborn and resilient. At the start of the video, I quoted, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." I wholeheartedly believe that this statement applies to Dana White. He was the hero who saved the UFC and in turn put MMA on the mainstream map, which breathed life into a dying sport. Nowadays, he isn't the most fondly thought about figure. Many people resent him for the way in which he runs the league and accuse him of being exploitative. In any case, it's interesting to note that while public opinion of Dana has drastically shifted, the one constant over the years was Dana White himself.